I thought my boss was a mentor, until I found out he was stealing from me. I used to look up to my boss. I thought he was a mentor, someone who genuinely cared about my growth and success. But one day, everything changed when I found out he was stealing from me in ways I could never have imagined. How did I uncover the truth? And what happened when I confronted him? Well, it's a story I still can't believe happened to me. This is how everything fell apart, and how I walked away from the worst betrayal I could have ever experienced. Before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. It was supposed to be the perfect job. I had just graduated from college and landed my first real corporate gig. I was thrilled. The office was sleek, the benefits were great, and I was ready to make a name for myself. My boss, Brian, was a seasoned pro. He had a reputation for being tough but fair. He'd been in the industry for years, and I genuinely thought I could learn everything from him. He'd take me out for coffee, give me tips on how to climb the corporate ladder, and sometimes he'd even let me sit in on meetings where the big decisions were made. I admired him. At first, it seemed like everything he did was to help me. He'd praise my work and offer constructive criticism to help me improve. He made me feel like I had a real shot at success. He even brought me into some important projects. But over time, something started to feel off. There was a subtle shift in the way Brian interacted with me. He started getting too comfortable. He'd ask me to stay late for special projects, sometimes even during weekends, claiming it would be a great experience. I never questioned it. I was eager to prove myself. But looking back, I should have noticed the red flags earlier. One day, things took a dark turn. I'd just wrapped up a long project and was excited to hand it off to Brian. He told me to email him the final documents. I thought nothing of it until I noticed something strange. The next day, a colleague of mine casually mentioned they'd seen Brian bragging about a project that seemed oddly familiar. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Oh, didn't you know?" she said, her voice low. "Brian presented that project as his own at the board meeting last week. He made it sound like he did all the work." My stomach dropped. That project was mine, all mine. Brian hadn't even acknowledged me in the meeting. But it didn't stop there. I started paying closer attention and realized that the work I'd been doing, my ideas, my reports, my solutions, were all being passed off as Brian's. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that I wasn't the only one. He was taking credit for the work of multiple people on our team, not just mine. The worst part? He was getting promoted while I was being completely overlooked. My hard work was being used to boost his career, while I was stuck in the same position, watching him climb the ladder with my effort. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I had put my blood, sweat, and tears into every project I worked on, and yet it felt like I was invisible. Brian was taking credit for things I'd done, and I wasn't even getting a thank you. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I had to confront him, but I wasn't sure how to go about it without blowing my career in the process. One afternoon, I decided to approach him. I wasn't going to accuse him outright. No, I wasn't stupid. I had to play it smart, gather my evidence, and make sure I wasn't coming off as paranoid or petty. "Hey, Brian," I started casually, trying to sound friendly but firm. "I've been noticing some things lately, and I wanted to get your take on them." Brian turned to me with a smile, though I could see a flicker of concern in his eyes. "What's up?" I hesitated. "Well, it seems like some of my work is being credited to someone else, not just on this last project, but a few others too. I just wanted to understand how that's happening." His smile faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "You're overthinking it," he said, brushing me off with a wave of his hand. "Don't worry about it, all right? Just keep doing your job, and we'll talk about it later." But I wasn't satisfied with that answer. That was his way of brushing me aside, making it seem like nothing was wrong. I knew something shady was going on, and I wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. Over the next few days, I kept a closer eye on his actions. Every time he spoke to the higher-ups, every time he mentioned a project I worked on, I noticed he was taking credit for the work. But this time, I was ready. I started documenting everything: emails, conversations, even screenshots of the presentations where Brian had presented my work as his own. I knew it wasn't enough to just talk to him anymore. If I was going to confront him again, I needed solid evidence. It wasn't long before I had enough. I had everything I needed to expose him for what he was. Nothing more than a thief who took credit for others' work to climb the ladder. I scheduled a meeting with HR. I'll admit, I was nervous. I wasn't sure how they would react, or if they'd even take me seriously. But I knew that if I didn't stand up for myself now, it would only get worse. The day of the meeting, I walked into HR with a stack of papers, my heart pounding. I had everything laid out: emails showing his lies, reports with my name missing, presentations where Brian had taken full credit. I could feel the tension in the room as I laid it all out on the table. The HR manager listened intently, nodding occasionally. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "This is serious," she said quietly. "We'll need to investigate this. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We'll take it from here." I walked out of that meeting feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. Would they really do something about it? Would Brian get caught? Or would this just be another thing swept under the rug? I had to wait for what felt like an eternity to get answers. But when they finally came, well, it was worse than I had ever imagined. A few days passed after my meeting with HR, and the anxiety was eating at me. I couldn't stop thinking about what would happen next. Would they really do something? Or would I be the one left out in the cold, with nothing but the truth on my side? I didn't have to wait long to get an answer. One morning, as I walked into the office, I was immediately called into HR's office. My stomach dropped, and my mind raced. This was it. The moment I'd either get some justice, or my career would go down in flames. When I entered, both the HR manager and the head of the department were sitting across from each other, their expressions unreadable. My heart was pounding. "Please, have a seat," the HR manager said. I sat down slowly, trying to steady my nerves. After a brief pause, the HR manager spoke. "We've completed our investigation, and it appears that there is substantial evidence supporting your claims. Your work was being passed off as Brian's, and this wasn't just an isolated incident. We've also found that other employees were affected in a similar way." My jaw dropped. I hadn't expected them to uncover that much, but I wasn't about to jump for joy yet. The situation was still delicate. "We've also discovered that Brian has been engaging in some unethical practices beyond the credit theft," the HR manager continued. "There are reports suggesting financial discrepancies and other questionable actions. We're looking into those now, but there is no doubt that his actions were damaging." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't just imagining things. Everything I had suspected was true, and now the company was acknowledging it, but part of me still hesitated. I didn't know how far this would go. "We'll be taking appropriate action, and you will be kept in the loop," the HR manager said. "For now, we suggest you focus on your work while we handle this internally." I nodded. It was surreal. The same company I had once admired for its integrity was now dealing with one of its own leaders who had turned out to be a fraud. But what struck me the most was the fact that my actions had made a difference. I had stood up for myself and refused to let Brian get away with what he was doing. And now, my decision to take action was going to change things. As I left the HR office, I couldn't shake the feeling of satisfaction. But deep down, I knew that this was just the beginning. Over the next few days, Brian's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was more defensive, more frantic. Word got out that HR was investigating him, and he started acting like a man on the edge. There were hushed conversations in the hallways, and a few colleagues even approached me with their own stories about how Brian had taken advantage of them. It was becoming clear that I wasn't the only one who had been wronged. One afternoon, Brian cornered me in the break room. He looked different, like a man who had just realized his world was about to crumble. "You're going to regret this," he muttered, glaring at me. "You've made a huge mistake." I stood my ground, not flinching. "No, Brian, you made the mistake, and now you're going to have to live with the consequences." I wasn't backing down. The tension was palpable, but I knew I was in the right. After the meeting with HR, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but the situation was far from over. Sure, Brian was out of the picture for now, but his shadow loomed over the company like a dark cloud. The fact that he was still employed until that moment had meant that his influence had been undeniable. But now that he was gone, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would the company truly change, or would the same toxic culture continue? The fallout from the investigation was more extensive than I had imagined. I'd been so focused on the impact it had on me that I didn't fully grasp how deep Brian's manipulation had run. Colleagues who were once silent were suddenly speaking up. Employees who had kept their heads down out of fear or indifference now started to come forward, sharing their experiences. It was a bittersweet moment. On one hand, I was glad to see people reclaiming their voices. On the other hand, I couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt. Why had I waited so long to speak out? As I went through the motions of my daily routine, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led up to this point. It wasn't just about Brian's wrongdoing, it was about the culture that had allowed him to thrive in the first place. There had been warning signs all along, but I had either ignored them or dismissed them as minor issues. Now, the weight of it all was impossible to ignore. But there was another side to this. In all the chaos and destruction, I had found something unexpected: strength. I had been able to stand up for myself when it mattered most. Despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, I had done what needed to be done. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something important. If I had done it, so could others. People were coming forward, and it wasn't just about blowing the whistle on Brian anymore. It was about changing the system. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to go through what I had gone through, that no one else would fall victim to the toxic environment. And suddenly, the full scope of what we could achieve together started to sink in. We weren't just getting rid of a bad boss, we were creating space for a better workplace, one where honesty, integrity, and respect could thrive. But change takes time, and as much as I wanted things to be fixed right away, I had to be patient. There was still work to be done. It was a bittersweet feeling, knowing that I'd been part of something that could make the workplace safer for everyone. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. What if Brian tried to come back? What if the people who had allowed him to get away with everything would now turn on me for causing all this trouble? For the first time in a while, I felt genuinely uncertain about the future. I had taken a step towards justice, but I wasn't sure what the path ahead would look like. All I knew was that I couldn't back down now. As the days passed, the reality of the situation began to settle in. Brian was out, but the scars of his reign still remained. The company had put on a brave face, saying all the right things about moving forward, creating a more positive work environment. But the tension was palpable. It wasn't just the employees who were affected. Many of the higher-ups were also uncomfortable with the shift in power. In the weeks that followed, I was approached by a few of my colleagues, some with words of support, others with warnings. It was strange. People I hadn't spoken to much before were suddenly eager to engage with me, either to thank me for what I had done or to cautiously warn me about what was to come. Some even told me that I had earned the respect of people who had previously overlooked me. It felt like a double-edged sword. While I appreciated the validation, I knew that stepping into this role as an advocate for change wasn't going to be easy. But then, something unexpected happened. The higher-ups began to turn their attention toward me. Not in a congratulatory way, but in a more calculating manner. I'd been hearing rumblings of a potential promotion, but now it felt more like a subtle attempt to keep me under their watchful eye. Were they genuinely impressed with what I had done, or were they just trying to keep me in line? I couldn't tell. I found myself caught in a web of corporate politics. The more I pushed for change, the more it felt like I was being maneuvered. At first I thought I could rise above it, but the further I went, the more I realized how much I had underestimated the depths of corporate manipulation. It was as if the company had a way of bending everyone to its will, no matter how noble their intentions might be. I was no longer sure who I could trust. My colleagues who had once been supportive now seemed distant, unsure of where they stood in this new power dynamic. Those who had remained silent during Brian's tenure were now coming out of the woodwork, but their motives were unclear. Some seemed eager to align themselves with me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were merely trying to ingratiate themselves with whoever held the power. The lines between allies and adversaries had blurred, and through all of this, I couldn't help but wonder. Was I just another pawn in a game I didn't fully understand? I had gone up against Brian, yes, but now I was face to face with a system that had been in place far longer than he had. This wasn't going to be a quick fix, and I couldn't just expect things to get better on their own. It was becoming clear to me that the real battle wasn't about getting rid of one bad boss. It was about challenging the entire culture that allowed people like Brian to rise in the first place. I had taken the first step, but now I had to be ready for what was coming next. There was no going back now. The tension at work only seemed to grow as time went on. Every day felt like walking on a tightrope. The company's leadership kept putting out the message that they were committed to making things right, but their actions didn't always match their words. There were new policies, new training sessions, and even a few changes to the team structure. But underneath it all, the culture remained the same. The power plays, the whispers behind closed doors, and the silent backstabbing were still very much alive. I started getting more involved in meetings, pushing for actual change, speaking out against the things that weren't working. But with every word I spoke, I felt like I was swimming upstream. It was exhausting. Every suggestion I made seemed to be met with resistance. They didn't want to rock the boat too much, they said. They didn't want to risk upsetting the status quo, but I couldn't sit back and accept that. Not after everything that had happened. If I was going to stay, if I was going to be part of this company, I needed to do more than just survive. I needed to challenge the system. One afternoon, I found myself sitting across from my boss, who had recently been much more cold and distant toward me. She was the one who had promised things would change after Brian was gone, but but now it seemed like she was the one holding everything back. She kept saying the right things, but I could tell by the way she avoided eye contact and fidgeted with her pen that she wasn't fully committed to the cause. I had to call her out. "Look, I get it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know we're in a transition period, but if we don't make real lasting changes now, nothing is going to be different. We can't just go through the motions of saying the right things and hoping it all works itself out. We have to actually change the way we work, the way we think." She sighed, setting down her pen. "I understand, but you have to realize the pressure we're under. It's not as easy as you think. There's a lot at stake here, and sometimes we have to move slower than we want." I shook my head. Sometimes you just have to take risks. Sometimes you have to do what's right, even if it means shaking things up. And I'm telling you right now, if we don't do that, we're just going to end up in the same place we were before. And I don't think anyone wants that." The silence in the room hung heavy. She looked at me, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Uncertainty. For a moment, I thought she might actually listen. But then she stood up and quickly ended the conversation, offering a vague promise of looking into it. It was the same old song and dance. It was frustrating, but it also fueled something inside me. This wasn't just about getting approval anymore. It was about making sure that what happened to me and the others didn't just fade into the background. It was about creating a new normal, one where the toxic behavior was no longer tolerated, where leadership wasn't about power, but about people. But I knew I couldn't do it alone. The more I tried to push for real change, the more it felt like I was banging my head against a wall. I'd hoped that by speaking up, I could rally others, that we could create a collective force for change. But as the days passed, it became clear that most people weren't as invested in shaking things up as I was. Sure, there were a few who supported me, but they were still too afraid to step forward openly. They were content to keep their heads down, take their paychecks, and let the system continue its toxic ways. It was maddening. Here I was risking everything to create a better environment for all of us, and it felt like I was the only one who truly cared. The others? They either didn't want to rock the boat, or they were too intimidated to challenge the status quo. I remember one lunch break, sitting in the break room, trying to gather my thoughts. I was scrolling through my phone, reading articles on workplace culture, leadership, and employee empowerment. I needed something to keep me going, to remind me that this fight wasn't just for me, but for everyone stuck in the same system. That's when I got a message from a colleague I hadn't spoken to much. Her name was Sarah, and she worked in the marketing department. Her message was simple. "I think you're right. I've been talking to a few people, and I think we need to do something more than just talk. Let's meet." I didn't know what to expect, but something about her message gave me hope. Finally, someone else who was willing to fight for real change. We met that afternoon after work at a local coffee shop. Sarah wasn't the most outspoken person, but her sincerity was clear. "I've been watching you," she said, "and I agree with everything you're saying. I've been in this company long enough to know that nothing is going to change unless we all push for it. But we need a plan. We can't just go around hoping for change." Her words hit home. She was right. We needed more than just words. We needed action. And action, I realized, meant more than just standing up in meetings and hoping that leadership would listen. It meant organizing, strategizing, and uniting people who were ready to risk something to change the company for good. We spent hours brainstorming that evening, mapping out ideas for a new initiative, an anonymous feedback system where employees could voice concerns without fear of retaliation, training programs that focused on empathy and inclusivity, and a campaign to hold leadership accountable for their promises. The more we talked, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about changing the company. It was about changing the entire culture. A culture where employees felt like they had a real voice, where leadership was held accountable, and where toxic behavior was never tolerated. I left that meeting feeling more energized than I had in weeks. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone in this fight. Sarah wasn't just a colleague, she was an ally, and we weren't going to stop until we saw real change. As the weeks went by, things started to shift, slowly but steadily. Sarah and I kept working behind the scenes, talking to people, gathering support, and building a coalition of employees who were ready to stand up. We set up that anonymous feedback system we had talked about, and to our surprise, it was a hit. People who had been too afraid to speak out before suddenly had a platform. They could share their concerns without fearing backlash. The atmosphere at the company started to change, little by little. Of course, there were still people who were resistant. The higher-ups especially were not thrilled with the idea of being held accountable for their actions. But as more and more employees voiced their concerns, it became harder for them to ignore. The message was clear: Things needed to change, but it wasn't just the company that was changing. I had changed too. The journey I'd been on, from that first moment I stood up to Brian, had reshaped me in ways I hadn't expected. I had gained a level of confidence I never knew I had, and I had learned what it truly meant to lead, not by power, but by example. I realized that change wasn't something that happened overnight, and it wasn't always pretty, but it was worth it. Then one afternoon, I got a call from the CEO's office. I had no idea what to expect. Had we gone too far? Were they finally going to crack down on our efforts? When I walked into the meeting, I was surprised to see not only the CEO, but a few other top executives sitting there, all looking unusually serious. They didn't waste any time. "We've seen the changes you and your team have made, and we've heard the feedback," the CEO said. "There's been a shift, and we can't ignore it. It's clear that the culture is changing, and we're not sure we're ready for that. But we can't keep pretending like everything is fine either. We want to know what you need to make this work. If we're going to keep moving forward, we have to do it together." For a second, I was speechless. I had prepared myself for resistance, for a fight, but this was different. This was acknowledgement. This was the start of something real. We laid out our plans, more open communication, leadership training, and a system of checks and balances that would prevent any one person from gaining too much power. We made it clear that we weren't asking for permission. We were asking for commitment. If the company wanted to change, it couldn't just be on the employees. The leaders had to lead by example too. By the end of the meeting, they agreed. The work wasn't done, not by a long shot, but we had taken the first step toward creating a company that was better, safer, and more inclusive for everyone. It wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't about proving a point or winning a battle. It was about creating a culture where people didn't have to fear their bosses, where they could speak up and be heard. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on the path to making that a reality. Before we wrap up, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's keep moving forward.